Welcome to Rumination, the podcast that offers practical solutions to the challenges in our dairy industry today. Hi, I'm Chris Gwynn, and I'm your host. And today, super excited to have Dr. Barry Bradford on with us to discuss the research that he's been doing for a number of years. Dr. Bradford at Michigan State University holds the position of the Clinton E. Meadows Endowed Chair for Dairy Management. He's a PhD graduate from Michigan State, and for the last 13 years had been at Kansas State University before returning to Michigan State to take on the endowed chair in 2020. He's well known in the industry for his work in linking immunity, metabolic challenges, reproduction, and all the things that can go wrong in early lactation if we don't take care of them. Dr. Bradford's work continues to remind us of the focus of the unique nutritional needs during periods of stress, in particular of the transition cow. Dr. Bradford, it's a real pleasure to have you on Rumination today.
Thanks for the opportunity, Chris. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great. So you share with me a paper you wrote in 2016 that talked about the phrase nutrition 2.0, and that kind of piqued my interest of why we should be talking some more. So can you explain a little bit more what you mean by nutrition 2.0?
With that terminology, we're kind of referring to a new generation of understanding nutrients and how we should feed them. And it implies that there was a nutrition 1.0, and I use that to sort of describe the first 80 years or so of modern nutrition science from the late 1880s through the mid-1900s, which really set this framework of needing nutrients really in three different ways. First of all, we need fuel, right? So we can use carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, all for fuel. But we also need building blocks, so we're not as flexible there. If you're going to build an organ or muscle, you need certain amino acids. Yeah. You need certain minerals for building bone. And then we have very specific requirements for cofactors. So think of vitamins that are essential parts of reactions that are important for metabolism. So those are really the three ways that we thought about nutrients being important or potentially affecting the body. But with the discovery in the Human Genome Project that there are hundreds of sensors in the genome that are apparently designed to sense nutrients and change cell function depending on the concentration of nutrients, we now have a whole different way that nutrients can affect the body and can do so without even being used necessarily. And that on top of all the additional things we've learned about the microbiome across species and all the interactions of all those new factors just opens up a whole different way of thinking about using nutrients to change animal biology.
Yeah, it certainly has been fascinating. So with those ideas of nutrients, can you expand a bit more on some specific examples of nutrients that might impact cellular function? I know in your paper you talked about methionine, you talked about choline, there was even a mention of folic acid.
Yeah, I mean, really every nutrient class, I used to sort of keep minerals to the side a little bit until we, again, discovered there are actually cell sensors that will respond to minerals as well. So every single class of nutrients, minerals, vitamins, proteins, carbohydrates, they all have these kinds of potential effects. One that we could dig into a little bit is beta-hydroxybutyrate. Maybe we wouldn't tend to think of it as a nutrient, but it is a metabolite that we're really interested in, and this, of course, is what gets elevated during ketosis. So one example there is there has been a long ongoing understanding of, on farms, a link between cows getting ketosis and cows having a greater risk of mastitis.
Yep.
And some people had done some work where they took immune cells out of transition cows and showed that if they cultured them in the presence of ketone bodies, it changes the responsiveness of those immune cells, makes them less responsive to being stimulated. And we just this year published a paper led by Turner Schwartz, a postdoc in my group, where we showed that if you infuse ketone bodies to mimic subclinical ketosis that cows have after calving, it actually dramatically impaired the ability to fight off a mastitis that we induced. So we challenged cows with strep uberis, and if they were getting ketone body infusions, they had substantially higher bacterial counts and a much worse resolution of that disease. So just one example of, we're pretty sure that's happening through a signaling effect through one of these cell sensors, and that's dramatically altering the cow's resilience to disease challenge.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all linked, and I guess we always saw these problems linked on the farm. We just didn't know it, so it's great to draw a pattern on the biology. So, with that in mind, how do dairy nutritionists, dairy producers use the approach of nutrients as signaling to improve performance on farm, in particular during, and you quoted again in this paper, the idea of traumatic times, these stress periods? How would they utilize those concepts, or how should they be thinking about it?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways that we need to think about things differently in light of this. One of them is, there's always been the mantra in ruminant nutrition of the cow-like consistency, and there's some truth to that. The microbial fermentation in the rumen, we don't want violent shifts day to day. But I think we kind of take that too far. I think there are opportunities. I have colleagues that are interested in exploring, for example, if we see shifts in weather patterns coming, maybe not so much in Ontario, but, hotter climates,
Yep.
if we see heat waves coming, should we be putting in a different vitamin mineral pack, to give that cow some tools to deal with that? And actually, there's some nice work just shared at the dairy science meetings in the last month, pointing in that direction. So I think that's one thing, thinking about more nimble nutritional adjustments instead of just this, we're going to find the right diet and stick with it all the time. And then precision can also come in terms of targeting animals, right? So there may be nutritional strategies that may not make sense to feed your entire herd all the time, but can we set up your program, your penning, your feeding technology so that you can target fresh cows at least? And lots of people do that. But even within fresh cows, is there a way to target your high-risk cows so that maybe we can consider very expensive strategies, but for very targeted populations, it may still make a lot of sense. And the other point I'd make quickly, we mentioned folic acid as a neat example of a nutrient that has effects that maybe we wouldn't have pointed to in the past. I think one of the reasons I pointed to that in that paper is there's pretty neat work in mice showing that males that are folic acid deficient will actually confer potentially birth defects on offspring. And we used to think only dams, only mothers could have that problem. So how does that work? They're only giving the sperm, right? Well, sperm can have what's called epigenetic changes from a lack of folic acid. So you have different chemical modifications to DNA that actually influence how traits are expressed in the offspring. So we have this multi-generational thing. So, not to say that you have to just accept that you have to feed whatever somebody pushes at you as being important, but it is worth considering, like, how long-term are the effects? So if you're going to play with an additive and you want to see the impacts in 3 weeks, that might not really make sense. A lot of these strategies, it may be weeks, months, even years where you see the effects.
Yeah, and I think to expand on that, there's been some, obviously, the heat stress impact on offspring, heat stress of the dam impact to offspring has kind of reminded us and opened our thought process that, yeah, when we make changes, we're always thinking about component yield and how important that is. But you also stressed in the same paper that sometimes we have to think about strategies like this epigenetic effect. And I think there's data from the same thing can happen with dams and their impact on offspring, nutritionally as well as management, that we need to invest not just for this generation, but for future generations. It's going to change how we do things over the next number of years. So thank you for those comments. So as we wrap it up, I always like to ask take-home messages. How do we include the thoughts of like enhancing grouping and precision farming strategies? How do we use that to evaluate what we're doing on farm? What are the take-home messages that you would remind nutritionists and dairy producers of how they should approach thinking about nutrition 2.0?
Yeah, I think in a competitive commodity business like dairy, people are looking at every penny, right? So it's and you have to, and so I understand that. I think you have no choice. On the other hand, if you're going to do that, you need to do the return on investment math correctly. And I think one reason I focus on transition cows is we know from lots and lots and lots of research is if you can prevent major train wrecks for a 2-week window, the carryover benefits are massive. And actually, one example, we did a study where we fed a phytochemical intended to be an antioxidant. We think that, antioxidant and anti-inflammatory. We think that's how it's working. And fed it for just the first 60 days of lactation. And we have these carryover effects then that last through 300 days of milk, right? So it's easy to say, oh, this strategy is another 25 cents per cow per day. There's no way that could pencil out. But actually, if you do the math, assuming you actually reduce disease incidence, potentially improve reproductive success, and have carryover milk benefits, there's a lot of things that we should consider that people sort of just dismiss out of hand. So I think that's my biggest
take home is focus on early lactation transition cows. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because the carryover benefits can be huge. Yeah.
Wonderful. Dr. Bradford, thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks for your insight and your continued research that you're doing. It's going to open up our ideas and eyes for many years to come. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
And I want to surely thank the audience for joining us today and listening and watching so you don't miss your next episode of Rumination. Make sure to find us at jeffo.ca, on Apple and Google Podcast, and on Spotify. And thanks to Jeffo supporting this initiative. Jeffo, a company based on precision nutrition for a growing world. And thanks again. Be safe.